Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Apache Diaspora, 4 Centuries of Displacement and Survival, by Paul Conrad. Narrated by Jonathan Yen. Publisher's Note: this audiobook may refer to visual elements included in the print and ebook editions of the book. Introduction. Fantastic and Terrible Stories. Everyone laughed at the impossibility of it, but also the truth, because who would believe the fantastic and terrible story of all of our survival, those who were never meant to survive? Joy Harjo, Anchorage. A young man walked the grounds of a school, counting graves. He had been sent to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in 1898 for an education, to be trained in welding, construction, and other industrial skills. As he passed through rows of gravestones, counting to 105 before he got mixed up, he learned other lessons. Very few came back, he observed. Sam Kanoy was one who did, however. He slipped away one night on a westbound train and returned to his people. At this time, his Apache Indian relatives were U.S. prisoners of war and had been since the Army rounded them up from their Arizona reservation in 1886 and shipped them into exile in Florida, Alabama, and then Oklahoma. Kanoy married and started a family. He settled on the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico after Apache POWs were finally freed in 1913 and given a choice of where to live. After his first wife died of pneumonia, he remarried and had more children. He organized his people in a bold effort to seek reparations for their 27-year internment. Most lives are full of tragedy and triumph, and Kanoy's was no exception. But his life was also particular, shaped by who he was as an Apache. Kanoy confronted challenges that his ancestors had faced for generations. How does one exist in a world that does not want you to exist as you are? How does one survive that which so many are not surviving? How does one start over in a foreign land, or on land made foreign by colonialism? Kanoy responded to these questions creatively, pushed back on those who mistreated him, and lived boldly without the constraints of his circumstances. Pulling back from Kanoy's particular story, a broader portrait of Apache life and death across North America and the Caribbean comes into view. Apache men and women throw themselves into the Gulf of Mexico, desperate to escape the boat waiting to carry them overseas. A priest pens an entry in a leather-bound ledger near the Pacific coast of Sonora. Another Apache girl buried after months of forced labor. Apache boys run errands for the governor of Quebec, and Apache women gather water for their masters at a neighborhood well in Mexico City. Apache men pull a pine tree out of the chimney of an old U.S. fort in Florida and apply mortar to Spanish fortifications in the port of Havana. An Apache servant and a black slave marry in a church in a Mexican mining town as a crowd of their friends looks on. Their children have children, who have children, their descendants still living across North America today. What can we say that would make us understand better than we do already? Joy Harjo asks in her classic poem, Anchorage. She proceeds to encapsulate in a few stanzas core themes of American Indian history, rootedness and displacement, pain and laughter, a seemingly impossible but true survival. In researching this book, I have often come back to Harjo's question. What might I say that would make you understand better than you already do the history of Native people confronting colonialism. As an outsider, I will never understand what it means to be Apache in America in the way Conoy did, and many writers have already offered powerful lenses through which we might understand stories like his. Evoking their insights, I could see Conoy's history as rooted in cycles of conquest or resistance to forced colonization. I could frame his tale as a story of surviving genocide, or as a story of survivance, among other possibilities. There is deep insight in all of these formulations, but there is also something not fully captured by them: the far-flung geography of Conoy's life and the lives of Apaches like him. These are lives of resistance, survival, and more, but they are also lives that map the diaspora of a people. The use of the term diaspora has expanded in recent years, and it has sometimes been employed simply as a synonym of migration, in order to describe any dispersal of a people from their homeland. Scholars employing a more rigid conception have argued that diasporas are characterized by the following: migration, collective memory of an ancestral home, a continued connection to that home, a sustained group consciousness, and a sense of kinship with group members living in different places. All 5 of these elements are evident in Apache history, even if some characteristics have been more pronounced at certain moments than at others. Recognizing that there was, and is, an Apache diaspora helps us understand Apache and North American history better. Diaspora is not a word in common usage among contemporary Apache communities, and for this reason I long hesitated to name what I was observing as such. Over time, however, I became convinced that I could not avoid the concept, in no small measure because Apaches so clearly expressed its significance in their stories, even if they did not use the word. They told of remembering when such and such child was lost over in that country, and of wanting to have all our children together where I can see them. They spoke in exile about longing to return to my land, my home, my father's land. They repeated valiant tales of displaced Apache captives' escapes and returns to kin against the odds. Diaspora is useful not only as a descriptor of such stories, but also as a concept for analyzing them. It requires following migrating people and considering their circumstances and choices wherever they ended up. Those uprooted from their place among Apaches struggled to survive in the absence of the societal recognition of belonging and kinship structures central to well-being in Apache lands. They responded to this existential problem by banding together with each other, and also by forming new relationships with outsiders. They often retained an Apache identity, but they also sometimes built new self-understandings as they navigated life in colonial societies across multiple generations. They were not only affected by the experience of diaspora, but they also influenced the societies in which they found themselves, especially when they were large in number, but sometimes even when they were relatively few. The experience of diaspora also had implications for Apache people who managed to remain in ancestral lands but felt the loss of their kin. This loss was most frequently rooted in affection, in the void felt by no longer being able to speak to or see a relative. In the era Sam Conoy lived, Apache parents sent care packages and letters to their children at U.S.-run boarding schools through the government mail system, soliciting news and telling them to come home soon. Past generations of Apaches had regularly petitioned Spanish, Mexican, or U.S. officials to return to them their loved ones who labored in Chihuahua, Mexico City, and beyond in the 18th and 19th centuries. These concerns also reflected material interests, because the loss of kin, sometimes on a large scale, could challenge the ability of a group to protect itself from enemies, obtain sufficient food, or even reproduce. The Chihenne Apache leader Victorio indicated as much when he explained in 1872 that U.S. efforts to force Apaches to reside on an undesirable reservation had scattered his people, and few babies had been born since. He told U.S. officials that if they instead allowed them to return to their homeland where they wanted to live, "We shall have many with us, and we shall increase." Such remarks illustrate how genocide, the elimination of a group of people as such, in whole or in part, was a central factor in the history of the Apache diaspora, either as an intent or as a consequence of imperial forced migrations, and as a motivation for Apache mobility. If diaspora represents the key analytical lens of this book, Apache history and identity also warrant further introduction. Scholars have usually applied the term Apache to encompass those groups across the North American Southwest who speak dialects of a language in the Athapascan family. They explain the coherence of the category as being based on a shared ancestral language, similarities in belief systems and historical subsistence strategies, or ties of kinship across groups that facilitated alliances in times of war or for raiding or trading expeditions. It nevertheless remains the case that these designated Apache groups have recognized themselves as distinct, with identities defined most by belonging in extended families whose ties of kinship linked together larger collectives. There was not, historically, nor is there in the present day, one overarching Apache tribe or nation. Like many terms for Native American groups in common usage, Apache is what scholars call an exonym. It is a term originally used by outsiders to refer to a given group, rather than its name for itself in its own language. Historically, they distinguished themselves from others in the broadest sense through variants of the term Nde, the people. Yet Nde did not itself reflect a collective category of identity or a nation. It was instead modified by more particular understandings of belonging and loyalty that were closer knit. There was the extended family to whom you belonged, the cluster of families with whom you lived, and the links through marriage and other forms of kinship that tied you to neighboring groups of people that formed clans or bands, depending on the Apache group. The 19th century Apache leader Cochise, for example, knew himself as the chief or spokesperson, Nantan, for the families that formed his local group or Gotha. This group had a name based on its favorite camping spot in the Dragoon Mountains of what is now southeastern Arizona, Biat Siga, or there is a clearing on its summit. Together with other local groups linked through kinship in the broader region, Cochise's people formed a larger band, the Chokonen, or Juniper people. While the Chokonen had relatives among, and might sometimes call upon, the aid of other neighboring Apache bands, such as the Chihenne, Red Paint people, or Nedni, enemy people, they owed the greatest loyalty and possessed the greatest sense of obligation to other Chokonens. While some exonyms are relatively neutral in their connotations, referring to a people's way of life, place of residence, or cultural traits, many are derogatory. Sioux, little snakes. Comanche, people who want to fight all the time. Apache, enemy. The English glosses on Apache's own names for outsiders illustrate as much. Mexicans, people with brown eyes. Pueblos, people living close to the water. Navajos, little G-string people. White people, enemy. Many of the exonyms for native groups with which one is probably familiar were inherited from indigenous languages, but European colonizers had a penchant for generalizing and redefining them further. While sometimes this practice was rooted in ignorance, it was also often strategic. The use of the term Apache in the 17th and 18th centuries was in part fueled by colonists' interests in obtaining slave labor, declaring that the entire Apache nation had resisted Spanish rule and was therefore an enemy to colonial society, served to justify their enslavement. By labeling a wide array of surrounding indigenous peoples as Apache, the Spaniards and their native allies could ensure their supply of enslaved laborers would be abundant. A focus on diaspora casts Apache histories in a new light. Every tribe had a trail of tears, the Lumbee activist Helen Shirebeck once said, capturing a basic truth often underappreciated by non-natives. Forced migrations were unusually common within Apache history, however, because Apache homelands bordered competing nations and empires, and also because of the way Apache mobility challenged the interests of imperial invaders. The importance of diaspora and mobility in Apache history predated colonialism. Athapascan-speaking communities have resided and continue to reside not only in what is currently known as the U.S. Southwest and Mexico, but also in the Pacific Northwest and northern Canada. This linguistic connection suggests migration over time, as ancestral Apaches moved from the north through the Rocky Mountains into new southwestern homelands by the 16th century. Prior to the arrival of Spaniards in the late 16th century, Apache groups had developed a symbiotic relationship with village-dwelling agriculturists, such as the Pueblos of present-day New Mexico. Though most Apache groups practiced some agriculture, through the mobility of hunting, gathering, and long-distance trade, they also came to possess resources useful to their Pueblo neighbors: hides, meat, tools, pottery, which they might exchange for products they desired, such as corn and cloth. While Apache and Pueblo people sometimes came into conflict, especially in times of drought and resource scarcity, their ways of life were usually not in tension with each other, but rather were mutually beneficial. Apache mobility proved more challenging to European and Euro-American empires and nation-states and their citizens. Southern Apaches, for example, viewed their homelands as a chain of diverse landscapes with valuable resources that they moved between seasonally to plant crops, hunt, or harvest wild fruits throughout the year. This chain of places ensured that they had a diversified source of food and varied climates well suited to life during particular times of the year: cool highlands in the summer, warmer lowlands in the winter. Yet such mobility was anathema to European and Euro-American understandings of exclusive property rights, or to their understandings of fixed settlement and farming as linked to civilization and Christianity, or by the 19th century to their belief that exclusive jurisdiction over a defined territory was at the core of what it meant to be a nation. Apache mobility was not, in and of itself, timeless or unchanging. It was often sparked by adaptation to a colonial world in which capture, enslavement, and forced migration loomed. Ironically, the displacement of kin to distant places also served as an impetus for further Apache mobility in attempts to recover those in diaspora. Past generations of scholars sometimes explain this mobility and warfare in racial terms as innate and unchangeable characteristics. Apache wars with Mexico and the United States, in those analyses, represented an inevitable clash between races. Yet following the Apache Diaspora across 4 centuries highlights a different explanation. If they fought vigorously for self-determination in familiar lands, it is in part because they and their ancestors had so often experienced the opposite: subjugation and forced removal to foreign places in which survival in diaspora was difficult. Over time, diaspora played an important role in influencing not just outsiders' understandings of who was Apache, but also internal political divisions, identities, and places of residence among native groups. One illustration of this in the present day is the presence of federally or state-recognized Apache tribes in Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, and Louisiana. In part because the term Apache became meaningful to many natives themselves through colonialism and diaspora, I use the term throughout the book. I also make clear the specific band names of groups wherever possible, using the Apache language terms most familiar to contemporary Apache communities and scholars, such as Chihene or Choconen, rather than English or Spanish reference like Warm Springs or Mimbreño. While some may be familiar with Chiricahua as a cover term for Chihene, Choconen, Nedni, and Bedonkohe Apaches, I follow recent scholarly usage and the preferences of some contemporary Apache groups in using the term Southern Apache instead. This is in recognition of the fact that it was generally only Choconens who were considered true Chiricahuas historically. While many Apaches have conceived of their own history and identity as rooted in part in the far-flung places to which their ancestors were displaced over time, outsiders have tended to be most captivated by Apache histories of resistance to colonialism. For some, the very name Apache is probably inseparable from another, Geronimo. Though Geronimo hailed from a particular Apache band, the Bedonkohe, his overarching association with resistance to U.S. expansion has saturated understandings of Apache history at large. In his penchant for having his photo taken brandishing a gun on horseback, in his drive to continue a life of raiding for livestock long after most Apaches had settled on reservations, and in his participation in the creation of his own biography highlighting his martial feats, Geronimo played a role in building his celebrity and in shaping his image and that of other Apache people. As Geronimo has gone from villain to freedom fighter to controversial problem causer, depending on the era and the author, so too in many respects have understandings of Apache history more broadly. Many Apaches, including Geronimo, did in fact resist the United States and other empires militarily, but what is too often lost in the focus on daring raids and clever ambushes is what they were fighting for. Geronimo was unusual in the degree to which his actions were rooted in a desire for glory, property, or retribution. But even Geronimo exemplifies the importance of diaspora in Apache history. In the 1870s and 1880s, he fled the Arizona reservations to which he had been assigned multiple times because of rumors of being imprisoned and sent far away. He and his companions finally surrendered, in part because they had tired of the difficulties of life evading Mexican and U.S. troops in mountain strongholds in both nations, but also because they longed to be reunited with their kin. One American tourist who visited the Florida fort where Geronimo was held after his 1886 surrender wrote with surprise about seeing him nursing a baby. even a man deemed by many fellow Apaches to be a selfish troublemaker was not immune to the tug of kin in the face of separation from them. Two images from roughly the same time period serve to illustrate the connections between displacement and resistance in Apache history. The first is an 1886 photograph taken by Camilla Sidney Fly, an early photojournalist of sorts. Titled "Seen in Geronimo's Camp Before Surrender," it portrays a group of armed Apache men outside a brush shelter or wickiup on a rocky ridge, eyes locked on the camera. The idea for the pose may have come from the men themselves, but more likely it was from Fly. The overarching message to U.S. viewers at the time is not difficult to discern. The visibility of an Apache home might at first glance suggest a domestic scene, but the focus is clearly on the people outside the home. Formidable, armed men, and perhaps most unsettling, very young, armed boys. At the time, this photograph would have served as confirmation of viewers' worst fears. Whatever the success of U.S. soldiers in battle against Apache men, the next generation of Geronimos was being raised up to take their place. It would have also assuaged any concerns about the killing of native women and children in military campaigns. After all, the image suggested, they were belligerents too. This propagandistic image contrasts with another from less than 2 decades earlier. The French mining engineer Louis Simonat traveled widely to observe the mines of North America, and in an 1867 synthesis of his findings, he included an illustration recreating a scene he may have witnessed, which he titled, "Apache Prisoners Condemned to the Mines of Mexico." It paints a striking contrast to the photograph of Geronimo's camp. Here, an armed Mexican overseer stands over Apaches pounding away at ore. The overseer leans on his gun in a relaxed pose, puffing on a cigarette. The walled enclosure and distant cannon pointing at the group signify their subjugation, their back-breaking labor evident in the heavy load one prisoner carries off toward a doorway, muscles straining. The text of the book praises the riches of Mexican mines, while noting that Apaches posed a key impediment to mines' even greater productivity, even as they also provided a source of hard labor to break up ore when captured in war. Attention to the frequency with which Apaches experienced forced dependence far from home as prisoners, slaves, or students helps explain Apaches' drive for self-determination through mobility, diplomacy, and violence. The portrait of armed Apache men resisting empires that dominates popular and historical understandings cannot be understood without the other image, which reminds viewers of the Apache men, women, and children who strove to live out their lives in diaspora in unfamiliar lands as markets, empires, and nations sought to control them for their own ends. After all, in the era when these images were created, armed Apache men frequently traveled into Mexico precisely with the aim of recovering their displaced kin. The diasporic displacements and existential struggles of Apache people for survival have implications beyond the bounds of Apache history as well. Apaches influenced the places and peoples they encountered through their lives and labors, and also through colonial attempts to manage their resistance to the forms of race and gender-based servitude that marked colonialism. Their history reveals surprising ebbs and flows in the practice of Indian slavery. It illustrates the intersection of African and native diasporas and the influence of both on societies in North America and the Caribbean. It highlights parallels between U.S. officials and their Hispanic predecessors in southwestern America in their approaches to native people, sometimes out of emulation and admiration, at other times out of ignorance. It shows how deportation and incarceration became key strategies of state control long before the 20th century.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?